A woman stands at her vanity mirror, applying lipstick with the precision of a surgeon. Each stroke is deliberate, purposeful. But look closer. The mirror doesn't reflect her face. It reflects yours, watching her, wanting her, already half consumed. What does she see when she looks at what you've become? Maria had perfected the art without knowing she was practicing it. Every morning, the ritual began the same way. The careful selection of a dress that suggested rather than revealed, the perfume that whispered promises, the smile that held secrets just out of reach. She wasn't calculating these choices. They flowed through her like an ancient river following its course. The coffee shop became her theater. She would sit by the window, sunlight catching the gold in her hair, a book open but rarely read. Men would orbit her table like planets drawn to a sun they could never touch. There was David, the architect, who redesigned his lunch schedule around her presence. Marcus, the professor who suddenly discovered a passion for Ethiopian coffee. James, the musician who composed melodies inspired by the way she stirred her latte. Each man believed he was the protagonist of his own story, the clever one who would finally decode her mystery. They brought gifts, books she'd never asked for, flowers she'd politely accept, invitations to gallery openings and wine tastings. Maria received these offerings with gracious warmth, never quite saying yes, never quite saying no. She existed in the space between promise and fulfillment, where desire burns brightest because it's never satisfied. But here's what the men couldn't see, what their hunger blinded them to. Maria was as trapped as they were. She had become addicted to their attention, their desire, their endless pursuit. Without their longing gazes, she felt invisible, worthless, as if she might simply dissolve into the morning light. She had learned to measure her worth by the intensity of their want, and now she couldn't exist without it. The truth crystallized one evening when she found herself alone in her apartment, staring at her reflection, without an audience, without someone to seduce. Who was she? The mirror showed only emptiness dressed in beautiful clothes. She had become a performance with no performer inside, a song with no singer, just the echo of what others desired her to be. As Schopenhauer warned, she had become an instrument of the will, that blind force that drives all life toward reproduction and continuation. But the cruel joke was this. In using her sexuality as power, she had surrendered her authentic self to become whatever would keep the moths flying toward her flame. The ancients called it enchantment. Today, psychology names it codependent narcissism. This is the shadow side of seduction, not the confident manipulation we imagine, but a desperate performance born from a void that can never be filled. Codependent narcissism was first identified by psychologist Eleanor Greenberg, describing those who derive their sense of self entirely from others' reactions to them. We see it everywhere. The Instagram influencer whose worth depends on likes, the colleague who can't function without constant validation, the partner who needs to be needed so desperately they create dependency in others. Schopenhauer understood this dynamic through his concept of the will to live. He saw how sexual attraction wasn't really about love or even pleasure. It was the species' way of ensuring its continuation, using individual desires as puppets. The seductress, he argued, becomes as enslaved as her victims, trapped in an endless cycle of needing to be wanted because she has no independent sense of self to fall back on. In myth, she was the siren who lured sailors to their doom. In reality, she's drowning too, calling out not to destroy, but because she's forgotten how to exist without an echo. What does your hunger cost the person feeding it? When you orbit someone else's mystery, do you ever wonder if they've forgotten how to exist without being a mystery to solve? The most tragic seductions aren't malicious. They're mutual prisons built from beautiful bars where both the hunter and the hunted have forgotten they once knew how to be free. The siren's song isn't meant to destroy you. It's her desperate attempt to remember she exists. He keeps a drawer full of her hair ties, ticket stubs from movies they watched together, receipts from restaurants where she smiled. Each artifact carefully cataloged, dated, preserved. But when did collecting memories become a substitute for making them? And why does the drawer feel heavier each time he opens it? Thomas discovered love the way some people discover religion, with the fervor of the converted and the hunger of the starved. Sarah had laughed at his jokes, touched his arm when she spoke, looked at him like he was the only person in the crowded bar. That first night became his gospel, and every moment since had been an attempt to resurrect it. His apartment transformed into a shrine of their relationship. The coffee cup she'd used on their third date sat unwashed on his bookshelf. Her forgotten earring lived in a small velvet box beside his bed. He photographed everything, her hand reaching for the salt, the way she looked reading the Sunday paper, even her sleeping face in the early morning light. His phone contained thousands of images, a digital mausoleum of moments she'd never asked to be preserved. But the more he collected, the more distant she became. Sarah began to feel like a butterfly pinned to a board, beautiful but lifeless under his obsessive gaze. She couldn't move without him cataloging the motion, couldn't speak without him analyzing the words for hidden meanings. Every spontaneous gesture became data for his growing archive of who Sarah really was. The breaking point came when she found his journal, pages and pages of her conversations transcribed, her habits documented, her preferences cross-referenced like a scientific study. "I love you so much. I want to know everything about you," he explained, not understanding why she was backing toward the door. "I want to keep every piece of you safe." That's when Sarah realized the horrible truth. Thomas wasn't in love with her. He was in love with his collection of her. She had become an object in his private museum, valuable only for what she could provide to feed his hoarding of experiences, emotions, memories. He didn't want to love her. He wanted to own the feeling of loving her, to possess it so completely that it could never change, never leave, never disappoint him. Standing in his apartment, surrounded by artifacts of their relationship, Sarah understood that she had become invisible to him. He could no longer see her through the thick glass of his collection case. All he could see was his idea of her, perfectly preserved and utterly lifeless. As Schopenhauer observed, the will often disguises itself as love when it's actually the desire to possess and consume. Thomas's devotion wasn't selfless. It was the ultimate selfishness disguised as romance. The ancients called it devotion. Today, psychology names it obsessive love disorder. Obsessive love disorder, though not officially recognized in the DSM-5, describes a condition where attachment becomes pathological consumption. First studied extensively by psychologist Dorothy Tennov in her work on limerence, it manifests in our culture constantly. The ex who keeps every text message, the fan who believes they truly know their celebrity crush through social media stalking, the partner who needs to know where you are every moment of the day. Schopenhauer would recognize this as the will's most cunning deception, convincing us that love means possession, that caring means controlling, that devotion requires the death of the beloved's autonomy. The will tricks us into believing we love someone when we actually love the idea of owning them completely, of making them a permanent fixture in our internal museum where nothing can ever change or leave. In myth, love was madness sent by the gods. In you, it's the cage you build while calling it devotion. How many people have you collected rather than loved? How many moments have you tried to preserve instead of living? The cruelest irony of the collector's heart is that the more tightly you grip something beautiful, the more likely you are to crush it. True love, Schopenhauer might whisper, requires the courage to let someone remain mysterious, changeable, free, even if it means they might walk away. Sometimes the deepest act of love is closing the museum and learning to live in the present moment where nothing can be collected, but everything can be experienced. The boardroom table stretches like a dark river between him and the others. He sits at the head, watching their faces reflect his mood, like still water mirrors the sky. When he speaks, they lean forward. When he frowns, they shift uncomfortably. But tonight, alone in his corner office, he wonders, if no one was watching, would he still exist? Richard had built his empire one conquered will at a time. It began innocently, team meetings where his voice naturally commanded attention, decisions that others seemed relieved to let him make. But somewhere along the way, leadership became intoxication, the feeling of having others depend on his approval, seek his validation, orbit his opinions like planets around a sun. This became his oxygen. He learned to read people like instruments, knowing exactly which strings to pull to elicit the response he craved. For Jennifer, it was withholding praise until she worked weekends to earn his fleeting smile. For Marcus, it was alternating between criticism and sudden warmth, keeping him always off balance, always reaching for approval. Richard didn't see them as people anymore. They were sources of the drug he needed to feel real. Adoration mixed with fear, dependence seasoned with gratitude. His home became an extension of his kingdom. Maria, his wife, had learned to anticipate his moods, to arrange her emotions around his needs. Their children sought his attention like pilgrims, approaching a temperamental god, never knowing if they'd receive blessing or rejection. Family dinners became performances where everyone played their role in maintaining Richard's sense of supremacy, but empires built on worship are kingdoms of sand. The night it all began to crumble, Richard stood in his bathroom, looking at his reflection after a company party where everyone had laughed at his jokes, applauded his announcements, competed for his attention. He should have felt triumphant. Instead, he felt hollow, like an echo chamber where other people's voices had replaced his own thoughts. The realization hit him like ice water. He had become addicted to being needed, but in the process, he had forgotten how to need anyone else. Worse, he had forgotten who he was when no one was performing submission for him. Without their worship, he was nothing. A hollow crown, sitting on an empty throne, ruling over a kingdom that existed only in the mirrors of other people's fear. He had created a world where everyone around him was diminished so he could feel enlarged, where love was replaced by dependence, where respect became indistinguishable from terror. But the cruelest joke was that he was as trapped as they were, a tyrant who needed subjects to feel human, a god who was starving for the very humanity he'd sacrificed to feel divine. Schopenhauer understood this as the will's most seductive lie, that power over others could fill the void within ourselves, when in reality, it only deepens the emptiness by cutting us off from genuine connection. The ancients called it divine right. Today, psychology names it narcissistic supply. Narcissistic supply, a concept developed by psychoanalyst Otto Fenichel and expanded by Heinz Kohut, describes the addiction to external validation that certain personalities develop to maintain their fragile self-image. We witness it everywhere. The boss who needs constant praise, the social media influencer whose self-worth depends on follower count, the partner who maintains control through emotional manipulation, always needing others to be less than so they can feel more than. Schopenhauer saw through this illusion completely. He understood that the will to power wasn't actually about strength. It was about the desperate fear of insignificance. Those who need to dominate others, he argued, are revealing their own profound weakness, their terror that without external submission, they would dissolve into nothingness. The tyrant isn't powerful. He's the most dependent person in the room. In myth, he was the king who demanded worship. In you, it's every time you need someone else to be small so you can feel big. Who in your life has become smaller so you could feel larger? What parts of yourself did you sacrifice to build your kingdom of borrowed crowns? The most profound prison isn't being controlled by someone else. It's needing to control others to feel alive. True power, the sages whisper, comes from being so complete within yourself that you have nothing to prove and no need to diminish anyone else. The strongest person in the room is often the one who doesn't need to remind anyone that they're strong. She has 17 different laughs, each calibrated for different audiences. The boardroom chuckle, the coffee shop giggle, the dinner party trill. She's practiced them all in mirrors until they sound natural, spontaneous. But tonight, sitting alone in her car, she can't remember what her real laugh sounds like, or if she ever had one. Elena had mastered the art of being exactly who people needed her to be. At work, she was the consummate professional, composed, articulate, never letting anyone see her doubt. With friends, she became the perfect confidant. Why? Supportive, always knowing just what to say. On dates, she transformed into whoever would be most attractive to that particular man. Mysterious for the intellectuals, bubbly for the extroverts, wounded for the ones who like to play rescuer. The transformation happened so gradually, she didn't notice at first. A slight adjustment in her voice here, a shift in her interests there. She learned to read rooms like a psychic reads palms, intuiting exactly what personality would be most welcome and sliding into it like a perfectly tailored dress. Her apartment became a costume warehouse of different selves. Business suits for the ambitious woman, flowing dresses for the free spirit, vintage pieces for the quirky romantic. But success in performance art came with a terrible price. Elena began to lose track of where the performance ended, and she began. Did she actually like jazz music, or was that something she'd adopted for a boyfriend 3 years ago? Were her political opinions genuinely held beliefs, or just the safest positions for her social circle? When she looked in the mirror, she saw only a collection of masks, each one perfectly crafted, but none of them real. The breaking point came during a work presentation when someone asked her opinion on a topic she'd never had to perform an opinion about. For the first time in years, Elena felt the terrifying sensation of not knowing what to say, not because she lacked knowledge, but because she had no authentic self to draw from. She had become so skilled at being what others wanted that she had completely erased who she actually was. That night, she sat in her bathroom, removing layer after layer of makeup, as if she could peel away the personas like old paint and find her original face underneath. But there was nothing there, just the blank canvas she had covered so thoroughly that she'd forgotten what it looked like without decoration. She had achieved perfect social success by committing the ultimate spiritual suicide. She had murdered her authentic self and replaced it with a committee of pleasing performances. The tragedy wasn't that she wore masks. It was that she had worn them so long she could no longer find the face they were meant to protect. Schopenhauer would see this as the will's most insidious victory, convincing us that survival requires the death of our true selves. The ancients called it shape-shifting. Today, psychology names it the false self. The concept of the false self was pioneered by psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott, describing the protective persona we create when our authentic self feels too vulnerable for the world. It manifests constantly in modern life: the people pleaser who never expresses their real needs, the professional who maintains perfect composure while dying inside, the social chameleon who adapts to every group but belongs to none. Schopenhauer understood this as one of the will's cruelest tricks, making us believe that to be loved, we must become lovable to everyone, which ultimately makes us lovable to no one, including ourselves. The false self isn't evil. It's a survival mechanism that becomes a prison when we forget it's just a tool and start believing it's who we really are. In myth, she was the goddess of 1,000 faces. In you, it's the voice that asks, "What do they want me to be?" instead of, "Who am I?" How many versions of yourself do you perform each day? Which one of them would you miss if you stopped pretending? The deepest tragedy isn't that others might reject your authentic self. It's that you've rejected it so thoroughly you can't find it anymore. The bravest thing you can do isn't to be perfect for everyone. It's to be real for someone, starting with yourself. Sometimes the most radical act is taking off all your masks and sitting with whatever face remains, even if it's unfamiliar, even if it's imperfect, even if it's gloriously, terrifyingly real. In the secret room behind her walk-in closet, she keeps a scale that hasn't moved in 3 years and a dress she wore once in college when someone said she looked beautiful. Every morning, she visits this shrine of inadequacy, weighing herself against memories of who she used to be, measuring her worth in pounds gained and possibilities lost. The mirror in this room shows only what's wrong, never what's whole. Claire had learned to hate her body before she learned to love anything else. It started with her mother's casual comments, "Are you sure you need that second helping?" and evolved into a full-time occupation. By 35, she had become the CEO of her own self-surveillance company, monitoring every calorie, cataloging every flaw, maintaining detailed records of her daily failures to meet impossible standards. Her phone contained apps that tracked everything: steps taken, calories consumed, hours slept, water drunk. She photographed every meal, not to celebrate it, but to confess it, as if documenting her sins could somehow absolve them. Her bathroom cabinet looked like a pharmacy of shame: diet pills, appetite suppressants, metabolism boosters, each one a small prayer to the god of thinness that never seemed to answer. But the cruelest part wasn't the physical prison she'd built around food and exercise. It was the mental torture chamber where she spent most of her waking hours. Every social invitation became a calculation. Would there be food? Would people see her eat? Would they notice how she looked in photos? She had trained herself to see her body as an enemy that needed to be punished, controlled, disciplined into submission. The prison had no guards except the warden in her mind, the voice that whispered constant criticism. Too much, not enough, wrong, ugly, failing, shameful. This voice had become so familiar. It felt like truth, so constant, it felt like companionship. She fed it with comparison, scrolling through social media like a monk flagellating himself with the images of women who seemed to have solved the puzzle she couldn't crack. The revelation came not through triumph, but through exhaustion. Standing in her secret room at 2 a.m., Claire realized she had spent more energy hating her body than she had ever spent loving anything else. She had become a master of self-abuse, an expert in her own inadequacy, fluent in the language of never being enough. She had handed the keys to her happiness to a scale, to strangers' opinions, to a reflection that would never love her back. The most tragic part wasn't the years wasted. It was the recognition that she had chosen this prison. She had built these walls brick by brick, fed this demon thought by the thought, strengthened these chains with every act of self-rejection. And somewhere, beneath all that armor of self-hatred, was a person she had never allowed herself to meet. Schopenhauer would recognize this as suffering without purpose. The will turned against itself, creating pain, not for survival, but for the illusion of control in a world where we ultimately control nothing. The ancients called it penance. Today, psychology names it body dysmorphia. Body dysmorphic disorder was first formally described by psychiatrist Pierre Genet Taichiet in the 1990s. But the broader spectrum of body shame permeates our culture like a virus. It appears in the teenager who won't eat lunch at school, the man who won't take his shirt off at the beach, the woman who apologizes for her appearance before anyone notices it. Social media has weaponized this ancient shame, turning comparison into a full-time job we never asked for. Schopenhauer saw the body as the most immediate manifestation of the will, and therefore the most immediate source of suffering. But he would also recognize body shame as a particularly cruel trick, the will making us hate the very vessel we need to experience any joy at all. We torture ourselves with impossible standards, believing that if we can just perfect our external form, we'll finally be worthy of love, when the truth is that self-love is the only kind that can never be taken away. In myth, she stared at her reflection until she wasted away. In you, it's every time you look in the mirror and see only what's wrong instead of what's miraculous. What would happen if you spoke to your body the way you speak to your best friend? What would change if you treated your reflection like a beloved child instead of an enemy to defeat? The cruelest irony is that the body you're fighting is the only one you'll ever have, the faithful companion that carries you through every joy and sorrow, deserving gratitude, not warfare. Perhaps the most radical act isn't achieving the perfect body, but making peace with the one you have. The prison door was never locked from the outside. You've always held the key.